just to start, we're showing photographs that you made during the, I guess what you would call the LA street demonstrations that followed the killing of George Floyd earlier this year. That was like June or July. It seems like a million years ago.
Yeah.
What prompted you to shoot the photographs? What was the experience like?
I mean, for me, like as a street photographer by practice or trade, I when I was living in New York, it was what I did all the time. And so I was always looking for something to shoot on the street. It was easy to find stuff in New York. But when I came back to LA, it's just doesn't really have a street scene. It's not like a place for lively, great street photography like you find in like a New York or a London or Paris, even in Japan, those kind of places. And so when the protests started, I already naturally go to them because I care about the issues, but it gave me an opportunity to actually go out and photograph what was taking place, especially during this particular period in time when we were like supposed to be locked down for a pandemic.
So what you're saying is suddenly there was an explosion of activity on the street that
Right.
You cared about, but also it's like something to shoot for in a street photography style.
Right, exactly. It gave me something to actually like focus on.
What's interesting about that is you told me that when you started street photography, you were in New York, working for Samantha Bee, I think.
Yeah.
And also that you had like these two really notable mentors, Ruddy Roy, who's a really kind of amazing documentarian or photojournalist and very well known, but also Sarah Elizabeth Lewis at Harvard, which is sort of, justice through art or social justice in photography.
Yeah.
Talk about your mentors and how they influenced you.
Oh, I met Sarah at a dinner party, and we became friends from that dinner party. And I was like fascinated by her work, and we started talking about how much I like loved photography and was like looking to take it more seriously. And then I bought myself the Leica Q camera for my birthday, and I started shooting with that like pretty much every day. I'm just like, I'm gonna just take this seriously. I'm gonna take this camera everywhere I go. And I shot for a while before I showed anyone anything. And then I showed her just some of the photos that I like really liked. And I was at that stage where when you first are going out, you come back with like 200 photos because you're just snapping away crazy. And then like till you get to the point where like now I can go out and I'll take 15, but like I really like 7 or 8 of them, like versus taking 200 and liking 4 of them. And so when I showed them to her, she was like, "Oh, you have to meet Ruddy. Like, the looking at your pictures, like he's someone you should definitely be connected to or know." And she's like, "I think he could really help you like take it to the next level." And so we all had lunch together one day in New York, and after that lunch, at that lunch and after, we just hit it off. And she went back to Boston, and we just stayed like connected, and we would hang out all the time. And he was just teaching me pretty much everything he knew and what his philosophies were behind his photography.
You strike me. I mean, I don't even really know you, but you strike me as a person who not only connects with a lot of people, but you connect with the right people really at the right moment, like for what you're passionate about and what you're pursuing. And with Ruddy, that really seems. So what was his style in mentoring you or in offering advice? Like,
he's the best person, but he's like, when it comes to teaching, he does not like go easy on you. And that's how you get good. Like a teacher who will not like go easy on you because it's like nice or whatever. But I mean, he's not an asshole, but he will when you were like in that early stage and you're like so proud of a photo, he's going to tell you everything that's wrong with it. and for him, it was always pointing out what I could do better, and to the point where I could hear his notes in my head before I even like, when I would look at a picture, I could anticipate what he was going to say I should have done differently or what I could have done better. And that just made me better. And his big thing was intent and purpose. What is your intention behind the photo, behind taking this particular photo? And what is the purpose for it? Why did you press the shutter now? Why is this subject important to you that you're photographing? And versus just being out in the world, just snapping away and kind of being like, oh, that's cute, that's cool. Like if you're going to really connect with the world around you, it's well, how do you connect intentionally and purposefully to the things around you? And when you start thinking that way, you start to find different pictures, different photos in the world around you that you probably wouldn't see if you were just blindly walking around with a camera, just looking for something that was quote unquote cool or interesting. And that was kind of how my focus became, looking for primarily photos on the street that connected signage and advertising with what was happening in the image. And so juxtaposing life with words and advertising, because as a writer, I deal in words. And so one of his tasks for me was to look for words in the environment that connect to things that were happening in the world around me. And so I started primarily focusing my attention around how to juxtapose ads and words and with what people were doing around them. And I ended up coming up with some really cool photos that I really liked. And on the side of that, I was also just really loving photographing marches and rallies and protests, because it's so tied into our history as a country. So many great protest photos and photographers, and being passionate about those issues made it easy for me to connect with the people in those environments to take great photos, or to try to take great photos at least.
And the people are addressing issues that matter to you as well. I mean, the subject matter of the actual protest or the rally or whatever. Yeah. You know, it's interesting thinking back on some of the images of the many that I've seen of yours now on Instagram. I encourage people to look, but also your treatment of language. And I hadn't really, I mean, a lot of people do that, but it requires some real perception. And one that you pointed out to me is there's like a policewoman, behind the door of a car, and her, it's a very small part of the photo, but it's crucial that her name badge is Whitey.
Yeah.
But how do you see that after the fact, or you see that on the spot and go, oh my God?
With that particular photo, I saw it after the fact.
That's fantastic.
Because the image for me originally, as I saw it, was this militant police officer behind a police car door with a giant ACAB spray painted on it. And the frame within the frame of like her body being between the window pane of the police door with the window rolled down. And I thought that was fascinating. And so when I got home and I was going through it and I looked at it, and I mean, that camera is the Leica Q2 is a 47 megapixel camera. And that image popped up really big. And I saw the name badge and I was like, hold on a second. And for a second I thought, I'm like, that definitely said Whitney, but I'm reading it wrong. And then I reread it and I was like, oh no, that says Whitey. This is the most ironic thing, a protest for Black lives. And they said Officer Whitey. Like, you couldn't frame it better than that.
No, you can't make that up. That's incredible, actually. Huh.
I laughed so hard when I saw that. Oh man, I laughed so hard.
Part of what goes on with street photography is and you know this, but people who aren't into street photography don't necessarily know how crazy this is that things can be happening at an incredible rate. I mean, there's just nothing but change and flux and swift, and you're grabbing these little, with that camera, that sort of magic machine, you grab just a bite, I mean, you freeze that little slice. A lot of your images, and some of the ones from the demonstrations that I love, they're on the edge of chaos, like they're bursting with energy. There's action everywhere, corner to corner, and then there's a sign somewhere. And I don't know how much of that you see at the moment, or, I mean, that is really a tricky operation, is to see all that and decide, boom, now.
Yeah, it's definitely like with those photos, especially the more active protests, where people are actively doing things and moving around versus when people are just standing around chanting or holding signs. Like the active stuff, like the photos that you're talking about, was some of my favorite, which is just like corner to corner. So you can like find someone doing something in every inch of it. It's kind of timing. It's like you're watching the scene create itself, and then you wait for like your central person, the person you're kind of focusing on, to do something interesting, and then you take the photo around it. Or you watch how they shape the behavior of the people around them, almost like those fish that like can change direction on a dime, and all it takes is one fish to move one way and they all shift the other way. And it creates this thing where if you're paying attention close enough, you can see it starting to happen in front of you, and you know exactly when to take the picture because you're watching the action create itself. And then soon as someone does the thing that feels representative of that frame, you take the photo. That's just how I approach it. And so like the photo with the guy on the motorcycle is clearly just, that scene came out of nowhere. The street was empty at that, where they were at one point, like a few minutes before that photo. And they all came riding up on motorcycles. And that created just a burst of energy in the crowd. Everyone rushed to the streets, cars pulled up. And so you're just watching the frame, you're just watching the scene create itself. And then the moment the guy in the center of where I was standing, like raises his fist in the air, I'm like, that's the photo. And then once you like really look at it, you see like everyone in that moment was having a physical response to the sound of the motorcycle engines, the chanting of the people, the seeing someone put their fist in the air. Like it all created the scene for me to shoot it.
What's remarkable about great street photos, and that distinctly is one, is that energy communicates itself out of a still flat rectangle. Like that energy that was there just kind of bursts out of that photo. It's amazing.
Yeah, if you like, a little bit of that too is something else I learned from Ruddy, which is trying to get as many unobstructed faces or things as possible. And sometimes it only requires just a slight shift to the left or right, and now every face in your frame is unobstructed. Like it's so weird how it happens. Like you go back and you look and you go, oh God, I can see literally every face in this frame clearly. And if I had just moved over to the left or right an inch or two, that face might be blocked by a sign. That face might be blocked by like turned slightly in a different direction. And it's just, it almost becomes such a, when you've done it enough and you've taken enough photos, it becomes like subconscious where you don't even like think about it. You just see it and your brain knows now. Like it's such a strange thing, but I think it's like sports. Like it comes with the repetition of like, you walk out onto the field and you know how to play the game. Like you know how to do the thing you've done for hours and hours and hours of your life and in practice. But it also, I think a big part of it is looking at photos. I look at a lot of photos and I study like why that's a good picture, what makes that frame work. And then when you're out in the world, when you're embedding those things into your brain and your subconscious, when you see them or you see versions of it out in the real world, you don't even realize why that appeals to you. And it's because you've seen 100 Bresson photos that were framed perfectly and like that they're burned into your mind. So when you see anything similar to it, you don't know why you took the picture until you see it and you go, oh, that looks just like a Bresson photo, or that looks just like someone else's photo, in terms of maybe not its absolute quality, but in terms of like its relationship to like, that's like a thing that person would have shot or would have done in that way.
Yeah, you're saying it's like muscle memory for, basketball or something. You can't, if you think about it, you're going to screw it up. You just have to do it. Yeah.
Do it enough, you take enough, you see enough, and your brain starts to learn the language of visual framing and visual textures and photography, and all those things start to play a part in how you shoot and why. And I also believe once you start, especially as a street photographer, once you start shooting on the streets regularly and you take it seriously and you do it very, very, very often, you don't see the world the same as you did before you started shooting photography, because now you notice shadows, you notice colors, you notice textures, you notice juxtaposition of colors and people in frames. Like, you can't turn it off. Like, once you've started focusing on it, you just can't turn it off. And so there's plenty of times where I'm like driving around or walking around, and in the off chance I don't have my camera and I see it, I go, oh, that's a great photo. I wish I had my camera. Sometimes I'll take it on my phone because I just have it. But there are times I definitely wish I had my camera with me when I catch moments like that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no avoiding the case that just a sheer amount of shooting, purposeful shooting, like you're talking about, like, what am I doing? What's my intent? What am I'm really trying to see this scene makes a difference. You mentioned Bresson, and there's a famous quote of his where he said, the first 10,000 photos are the hardest. which I've always liked.
I mean, it's like the 10,000 hours thing. Like, it really is, like, until you've shot 10,000 photos,
right,
you've probably not really seen enough.
Yeah, and then possibly you transcend that and get to the point where, without a camera, like you're driving around and you're not with the camera, and you can't avoid seeing the way a camera sees. You're like, at that point, I see the colors, I see the shadows, I see, it's the way to see without the machine, right?
Yeah, that's the difference about being in LA versus in New York, where in LA I have to drive so much to go places, and I see things out the window and I go, oh, I wish I could stop and take that picture. Oh, I wish I could stop and do that. Whereas in New York, you're just walking. And so you can stop and take the photo, or you're in the back of a cab. You can get out whenever you want. And, or I would shoot a lot from the back of cabs and Ubers, because it wasn't very different than like being out on the street, because I was in the back of the car and the streets are so close and the people are so close, and you could do it that way. But yeah, I feel like I missed so many great shots. Shots here, because the streets are so hard to shoot here, and when you do see something, you're driving past it because you're going somewhere.
Yeah, I curated a show way back, probably like 20 years ago or something, that had showed work by a guy in Atlanta that were photographs I never took, and it was a big block of white large frames with just white. And then he had a grid of descriptions of these vividly remembered, like in your craft of writing, he crafted these things that he hadn't photographed, but they're just stuck in his head. It's beautiful.
That's really smart.
No, that's really smart. What was really funny is the work was shipped from Atlanta. And so he has this grid of, 1, 2, 3 that were, and the frames were numbered, so one, hang this one here, this one here. And I'm like, they're all the same. They're blank, right? They're white. Like, why? But he wanted to have the frames hung in the right order too, even though they had no images in them.
That's your dedication to that art piece.
Yeah, I know. That's going all the way with that idea. That's really well, another layer to these particular photos that are up at the California Museum of Photography, and hopefully opening soon, is the content, which is political issues and political demonstrations. And when you post things on Instagram, a lot of them are accompanied by your comments or text, or you're a writer, but also quotes from people. And one that stuck in my head was one by Gil Scott-Heron, the sort of great musician and jazz soul poet, or whatever you call him. No matter how far wrong you've gone, you can always turn around.
Yeah.
How hopeful are you at this moment, or how do you sum up your sense of the politics that are expressed in these photos?
No, I mean that quote it's such a great quote because it gives you just enough hope to hold on to when you feel like things are at their darkest or getting really dark. And I feel like that was what we went through as a country this last week or two, where we felt like we were at a point where we were going to figure out how far we were going into the darkness or whether we were making that turn back toward the light. And it was such an elation for people, to the point that, like, when's the last time someone was elected president and people were popping champagne bottles in the street? Like, that's just not a normal thing for this country, where we feel like that much is at stake, where if the right person wins, we would buy champagne and just pour it out in the streets. And that's something you see in other countries, where, like, people are in the streets, like, going crazy when a new president gets elected, or the right person gets elected, or a dictator gets ousted. And that's what I think we felt like in this last 2 weeks, where, like, the dictator was ousted. And for me, I feel like there's so many people that I know doing good work and fighting the fight. And I feel like as long as I can see the fruit of their labors, and that they are still hopeful from what they're seeing in the work that they're doing, because as much as I love to be involved in protests and social justice issues, it's still not my primary source of work. So there'll always be a gap, and there'll always be a distance to the complete texture of it. But when I talk to them and I hear how hopeful they are, and the things that they feel like, even throughout all the bad, that the good that is happening and the potential for good that's there, it keeps me hopeful. And they all have their bad days where they're like, man, today's like a hard day to be doing this work. But on the whole, like, the pendulum swings, and it's swinging back toward where it feels like it might be good to keep being an American and fighting for the version of this country that we want to see and that it can be, but hasn't necessarily reached the potential of yet. And that's kind of where I am now. I mean, it's kind of why I made the movie I made this summer, about the cyclical nature of, and the repetition of, what we experience as Black people and the Black community of death. And I hope one day that story can have a definitive end, and we can point to the period of time where we stopped being a country where the police killed over 1,000 people every year, no matter what color they were.
Well, that's underneath that. You, as a creative person, you retain faith in the ability of art, whether it's your writing or your photographs, to actually change the world in some way.
Yeah, I mean, people, it's funny because, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who disagree with me, but I think people love paintings. People spend millions and millions of dollars on paintings. I feel like there is no painting more powerful than a photograph. I think when you look at what photography has done over the course of history, photography has ended wars. Photography has changed legislation in this country. And you can't point me to a single painting that has the impact of those photos from Vietnam that turned the country against the war. You can't point me to a single painting that I think has the impact of the photo of the police dog biting the young black man in Alabama that was seen all over the world and made the world notice what was happening in our country, or the photo of Emmett Till laying in his coffin and being put in Jet magazine, and how that turned the tide on civil rights in this country. Just I don't I don't think I think there is a tremendous value and beauty to paintings, but I think there is a huge, in the art world at least, devaluation of photography and what photos and good photos actually, what their value actually is. And you look at the market for the two of them, and like I own a lot of really great photos from really great photographers, and even at the top of that list, the most expensive of them is $7,000 if you count like an Elliot Erwitt, who's one of the greatest photographers to ever live. And yet there are painters whose names you've never heard of, whose paintings are selling for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars every day. And it's to me, as a person who loves to shoot photography and do it with intent and purpose, I just find it interesting that there is such a disconnect between the value of those two things and their importance in the world. And I mean, you could buy the photo of the crying girl, the naked crying girl that I forget the photographer's name. That image that we all know.
Yeah, in Vietnam.
That photo should be worth $1 million. If you're talking about impact, if you're talking about importance, historical importance, like these are moments where there's so much that goes into being at a place at the right time, taking the right photo, the ability to take the photo in the moment. I feel like that's just how I feel about that particular thing, where I think there's so much being left on the table when it comes to the importance of great photography.
Yeah, that's the photo by Nick Utt shot on
Yes.
yeah.
Nick, yeah.
The funny story, or the story behind that, was Nick was working for Associated Press in Vietnam, and he came back with that film, that roll of film, among a few other rolls of film, and they were developing it. And his bureau chief, this guy Horace Foss, who's written a bunch of books, they developed the film, and they were looking at it in the darkroom, and he went, "You know what? That's a Pulitzer Prize right there." But like the film was still wet; it wasn't even drying.
I mean, think about the Tiananmen Square photo. Who doesn't know that image?
Right. It's kind of yeah. There's a comment. Now you and I are just sort of riffing, but there's a comment by an art critic who I forget who it was. He said, "You know what? I would trade every single painting ever done of Christ on the cross for a single blurry snapshot."
Right? I mean, that's a great quote. Like,
I know.
It really, I mean, it's such a special art form, and there's so much skill and luck involved. And I mean, you can stand on your canvas and paint for days and weeks at a time and get it right. But I mean, you miss a great photo, you miss it. You take a great photo, you took it. And those are like, to me, that's just special, man.